This meeting is being recorded.
Yes, this meeting is being recorded for posterity and anybody who can't be here today. Welcome to our third of five series of discussions of Jesus Interrupted. And we just lost Floyd. Oh, I don't know what happened. Yeah. And today, hopefully, we are going to be discussing chapters 5 and 6. Next week, we'll talk about 7, chapter 7, that he's titled Who Invented Christianity? And then chapter 8, which is where we get away from sort of the academic, historical, critical stuff and talk about what is faith based on. Okay, which is a logical conclusion to the question that he keeps asking. And sometimes I say, okay, Bart, enough is enough. But he's saying, if this sort of scholarship has been around for decades and even a century, how come so many faithful people in the pews still don't know it? Which begs the question, what are the clergy afraid of? That they don't share with their people in their local congregation the stuff that we all learned in seminary. Because as I said, there's nothing in this book published in 2000, looking it up quickly. Where is it? 2009. That I wasn't taught at CDSP in the late 1970s. Mm-hmm. Nothing new. So for me, this is all old hat. Been here, done this. And yet, as I've led discussions of this book, this is now the 4th parish. Everybody says, wow, I never knew that before.
I wonder if there is a sort of an overarching sense among the brother clergy that the bodies in the pews can't handle the truth, to quote
a certain notable character from a certain notable movie.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. You can't handle the truth, which is why we're going to get to the discussion of the left. What is your faith based on?
I would just intercede that it's not necessarily truth, it's a good guess.
Well,
Let's make it. Let's
Theoretical.
not make another.
I'm not following something. What do you mean?
It's a good guess. It's an educated guess. Where how all this stuff comes together.
Oh yeah,
But it's not.
it's highly educated
Yeah. Well,
and
but
based on years and years and years of.
right, there's highly educated people who disagree with that. That's the problem.
Yeah, and that's Floyd's coming back in. Well, hold on a minute. I got every once in a while I have to look at the screen.
So a lot,
Welcome back, Floyd.
well, I mean, we can. Right.
Oh,
He went away again.
and we lost him again. Floyd was just here and he's poof gone again. Maybe he's having connection problems.
My husband has this book on Paul. You know, there's a lot of controversy about Paul. So he really liked the book and what was in there. And so now I kind of want to, I'm in the section of this in Jesus Interrupted where he's talking about forgery.
Oh,
And which book were Paul. And so now I kind of want to map out which books are possibly forgeries. Then read my husband's book on Paul, which is controversial.
do you happen to recall?
No, I'll have to look it up when I get home.
Okay.
And then I think I want to read that book and say, okay, does he at all discuss forgeries? Or does he take all of these books to be Paul,
Mhm.
and then he goes after Paul, you know what
Well,
I mean?
and remember that 2,000 years ago, the concept of forgery may not have necessarily meant what you and I
Yeah,
understand it today. He talks about this is in the one of the sessions that we we're talking about last week, the chapter called Who Wrote the Bible, and it starts on page 112. I just happened to open it up. Are there forgeries in the New Testament? Well, it depends on what you mean by forgery. And he lists three kinds: misattributed, so none of the Gospels identified the author thereof, and the names were applied much later after individual communities had more than one, because there were no Xerox machines. It took a long time, and it was very expensive to reproduce any document. And so it took years and years and decades for all of these to get copied enough times and circulated around so that, one community had this one and that community had that one. And somebody with enough money could hire a scribe and say, well, we'll copy ours and give it to you if you will copy yours and give it to us. That took a long time.
I heard it took about a year to make it a Torah.
Yeah, and but the Torah is a lot bigger than just a gospel. But well, it depends on if you mean Torah in the specific sense or the whole Torah was Nevi'im Ketuvim, which is Torah, which is the law, prophets, and the writings in Hebrew. I didn't bring my Hebrew Bible, otherwise I'd show you it. List those. Anyway, misattributed writings, homonymous, that is, there are a lot of people in the world named Dave. So if something was attributed to Dave, it doesn't necessarily mean me.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And pseudepigraphic, that is somebody who intentionally writes in somebody else's name. Now, sometimes that was honorific. Think of pieces of music where a later composer will take a melody or a theme from an earlier composer and embellish it. My favorite is Rachmaninoff, variations on the theme of Paganini.
Exactly.
That the next to the last variation brings me to tears. It's one of those beautiful pieces of music I think that's ever been written. So was he cheating? Was he stealing? Was he forging? Well, actually, in the title, he says, I got this from Paganini. But what if he didn't? Okay, so there's that kind of thing. So just because doesn't necessarily mean is what I want to get at. It's not always. And then he talks about other examples in the ancient world that don't have anything to do with scripture, but where somebody, it tells the story of Galen, the Roman physician, who's walking around, wanders into a bookstore and finds a book attributed to him that he knows he didn't write. Okay. So, yeah. So somebody's trying to capitalize off his fame and writes a book attributed to him so they can pocket the cash. I mean, people haven't changed all that much over the centuries. So did that stuff happen? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So how do we know all this stuff? And one of the things that I want to talk about is I've just, here's my book happened to be, this is, I'm looking at the Gospel of John. This is Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene at Easter morning. And I'm just going to hold this up. This much is the Greek text. All of this down here is references to the various manuscripts and the variations in those manuscripts that the guys who made this Greek New Testament that I bought in 1975 used to sort of explain or say, this is why we think the original was this word instead of that word. And this is what the manuscript evidence suggests. So this is the kind of letter by letter, word for word, comparing hundreds of bits and pieces of ancient manuscripts that we have. And they haven't stopped digging, right? Archaeologists are still at work. So who knows what we're going to find next. I mean, we didn't know about the Dead Sea Scrolls and we didn't know about the Nag Hammadi Library until after the Second World War. So the folks who gave us what you and I know as the King James Bible, there's a story. The patriarch of the Orthodox Church in Constantinople heard that these English church folks who had separated from Rome, okay, so Orthodox Church, Roman Church, don't really like each other, okay? So England breaks away. The patriarch in Constantinople hears that they're working on a new translation of the Bible. And he says, ooh, that's an interesting idea. You know, we've got this old manuscript from the library in Alexandria that they might find useful. And so he sends it to them. But this being the 17th century, by the time the book gets from Constantinople to London, the English translators are already finished and the authorized version has been published. So it gets there too late. And it's hard for us to sort of remember what life was like. I mean, everybody here is old enough to remember the days before the internet, right? Before cell phones? Yeah. You know, when things were attached with wires. And so it's easy for us to sort of say, well, of course, this was, no, not necessarily. And so we have to keep reminding ourselves. So with all of that, oh, and then we've already used too much of our time. So let's get into, he's got a kind of a fun play on words. He talks about, beginning of this chapter 5, liar, lunatic, or Lord. He takes that from C.S. Lewis. Okay. And he talks about something about himself where a reporter from the Washington Post who interviewed him, who sat in on his class, and then wrote this article, misunderstood what he was saying. And okay, not the first time that's happened. And I'm trying to get to the spot. Oh, come on. This is, how can I or any other New Testament scholar or historian know what Jesus actually said about himself or about anything else? This is obviously part of a much bigger question of who Jesus really was, what he really taught, what he really did, and what he really experienced. This is the subject of many, many books, some of them extremely erudite and very long. Yes, a lot of it. And again, this is a historical question. It's not a faith or a theological question. Looking at it from the vantage point of a historian, which is different and which is something that those of us in the church are not accustomed to adopting, that sort of perspective. What can we really know? As he points out, if the Gospels were written 40 years after Jesus' ministry, was there a stenographer there writing down what he said? No, probably not. And there's another book, and I think I mentioned this last week. And again, I taught a whole course on it by Ray Brown, famous Jesuit Johannine scholar, called The Churches the Apostles Left Behind. And he talks about that period of time where the last of the people who could say, I heard, I saw, have died. There are no eyewitnesses left And of course, if you think the world is going to end tomorrow, if you accept the apocalyptic worldview, and Ehrman argues that Jesus probably did, which means in terms of Jewish theology of the day, he was much more aligned with the Pharisees than the Sadducees, because the Pharisees accepted it, the Sadducees did not. It's one of many differences between the two major groups within early Judaism. You don't bother to set up a structure. You don't think you need to write anything down because he's going to come back a week from Tuesday. Why go through the effort? It's only as year succeeds year, and what Paul expected to happen, he says it in his letters. Some of you reading this will be alive when this happens. Those words are attributed to Jesus. Some of you here will see this happen. So what happened when all those people were pushing up daisies and it still hadn't happened? And that sort of crisis of what are we going to do? And as I talked about last week, you can see some of that struggle. The technical term is the delay of the parousia, and the difference between Mark and by the time John is written. John rejects apocalyptic. He simply says, we must have gotten it wrong. We misunderstood something. It's not going to be an external change, because if it was going to happen, it would have happened.
Isn't it so consistent with the way they looked at Jesus when they were actually with him? This was
Well, yeah, so is it any surprise that a generation later, we still got it wrong?
right. So it's just humanness of.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Which sort of, so were the human authors simply scribes writing down what God dictated to them? How much of their own humanity gets in is, again, and so that's, and coming from where Ehrman comes from, for him, that's a big deal. For those of us in mainline Christian churches, that's not such a big deal because, again, we've been teaching this stuff for 100 years. This is not earth-shattering, folks. And if it is, it may say something more about your faith than biblical scholarship, which is what we'll talk about on our last session. So I don't want to get too far ahead. Yeah, so there was no, CNN reporter sticking a microphone in somebody's face as Jesus healed this person, or as Lazarus walked out of the tomb, or as the man born blind was suddenly able to see. So did those really happen? Well, from a historian's perspective, we can't say. That's not a faith question. That's a historical question. Like Shakespeare or Julius Caesar or Abraham Lincoln or any other famous person from antiquity. What can we say with any degree of certainty? It's not certainty, it's a level of probability. It's 99% probable or it's only 50-50.
Well, it's like all the things that are attributed to Mark Twain,
Mhm.
Samuel Clemens,
Yeah,
and probably 90% of them he never said or wrote.
yeah, but sure sounded
But
good.
it sounds like something he'd say.
Yeah, he might not have said it, but it sure sounds like him.
Yeah.
On page 147, he's talking about the issues of oral tradition. Because again, if the Gospels are being written some 40 years after Jesus actually said whatever he said and did whatever he did, that's 40 years of oral tradition. Now, interestingly enough, before I went to seminary, I took a class on folklore my last year at Northern Arizona. And people who study things like folk tales, like fairy tales, have done an amazing job. It's like, don't you guys have anything better to do? But it gets sort of interesting. And so you devote your whole life to studying things like variations on themes of folk tales and how they change. As, for example, if you take German folk tales and you collect them in Germany, and then you go to Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, where you had German settlers, and you ask them to recite the same folktale, is it the same or is it different? And one of the principles that they discovered is that the version that you find the furthest away from home is likely to be closest to the original version. Because over the passage of time, the folks back home tend to change it. But the folks who have left home aren't privy to the changes back in the old country. And so they're passing on what was the version at whatever time they left the old country.
It's the same with language. If you want to hear old French spoken,
Yes,
go to Quebec.
exactly. Say that again.
If you want to hear old French spoken, go to Quebec.
Right. That's right. And in fact, my last year at Emmanuel, Dick Johnson from Peace Lutheran and I led a tour to Germany. And there was a mix-up in our planes getting into Paris and making a connection to the next place, because we landed at the wrong airport. We were supposed to land in de Gaulle, and we ended up in Orly. So we had to get buses and drive all around the city to catch our connection. And I had an interesting conversation with a woman, can't remember, I don't remember, it was Air France but about that very thing. Because I had mentioned that, Mexican Spanish is not the same as Castilian Spanish. And she seemed kind of surprised at that. Well, I said, well, can you tell if somebody is from Quebec by their French accent? And she said, oh, of course. Well, it's the same thing. Yeah. Mexicans don't lisp. But when I was in Barcelona, they lisp. That's Castilian Spanish. It's not Mexican Spanish. And he talks about this. He says, do your kids ever play the telephone game at a birthday party? Oh, yeah. Where you sit in a circle and somebody whispers something and it passes. And by the time it gets to the last person, it's different somehow. He suggests it always works that way. I'm not sure that Barterman has ever studied folklore, because that's not necessarily true. But it is true that there are changes, and there are whole indexes of motifs that crop up in folklore, folk literature, in folk tales all around the world, and people have actually gone around and collected them, and it's fascinating. And it's one of the things that helped me wrap my head around this in-between time, between when Jesus was actually walking around saying and doing, and by the time the people actually wrote down about what Jesus was saying and doing. 40 years is a long time in the ancient world, because the average life expectancy was, if you were 30, you were old, right? Life was hard and lives were short. So 40 years is 2 generations.
It's interesting. I think about the New Testament, how we got it. I think about the about 60 years.
Think about who?
The Beatles.
Okay, yeah, because these folks can't hear you, so slow down and speak louder.
So I remember the huge controversy when John Lennon said, "Oh, we're more famous than Jesus."
Oh, yes, I remember that,
Right?
because I'm old enough.
That was, I don't think that's ever going to be misquoted. People are always going to remember that, and it's written down in many places, right?
We couldn't hear what he said. Can you repeat it?
Hold on a minute. He was referencing the time back in the 60s when John Lennon said about the Beatles, "We are more famous than Jesus."
So my comparison is the fact that he said something extremely offensive extremely controversial. A lot of people liked it, a lot of people hated it. But it will never be misquoted, most likely. And Jesus said things that were always being offensive. He was being John Lennon all the time. And so things were getting written down. And let's face it, they eventually killed him because he was being so offensive to the powers that be. So I have a trust in the accuracy of those things that he said because they were so John Lennonish and they will not be forgotten.
Up to a point, you're
Of course,
You're right.
up to a point, you know.
because he talks about what are the things that a later person probably would not have attributed to Jesus. Those are the most likely because they don't fit the narrative, right? So if Jesus is the son of David and the city of David is Bethlehem, why is Jesus from Nazareth? He should, to fit the sort of messianic story, he should be from Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Okay, so we get around this by having him born in Bethlehem for a so-called census.
Well, sadly, some originally from, that's why.
Maybe, or maybe this is to fit the,
We could, perhaps.
not everything. And that's the point. You don't have to be careful of doing exactly what he does, is thinking it's always black or white, all or nothing.
Right.
That's not true. And if you read him carefully, he makes that very clear. There are some things that we can say, yeah, he probably did say that. Because it's not likely a later writer would think of looking at it from that perspective, which makes it more likely to be true. And he gives several examples of that. So be very careful of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So just because this or that detail doesn't match, doesn't mean it's all hooey. That's going way too far the other direction, which is exactly his argument with the writer from the Post, who misunderstood him and thought that the reason he lost his faith was because of his New Testament scholarship. Wrong, any more than it made me lose my faith. And I learned all the same stuff because he and I were in seminary at roughly the same. I'm a few years older than him, so he arrived in 78, I arrived in 75. Same stuff. Right. So, which again is why we're going to talk about what we're going to talk about in 2 weeks. Because that's where it gets to, okay, if faith isn't just built on God said it, I believe it, that settles it, then what is it? And is there another kind of truth besides historical, literal, factual truth? And as a Jungian, to me, that's a duh, right? But not everybody's a Jungian, which is too bad. Oh God, it's recorded. I'm
Oh, no,
can't
you're.
deny it any more than Lennon could deny having said it, because
I was
that's
gonna
funny with
say,
the microphone in his face.
now it's recorded, David. You can't back that
I
one out.
know. Shame
What
on
do
me.
you really think?
Yeah,
Well, I was waiting for you to bring Jung in. I
Yes.
was waiting for you. My
right.
hand is like almost up to bring Jung in, but I didn't.
That's it. So I want to back up a little bit, and he spends in part of this, say what are the, I mean, in terms of some of the more radical deniers is saying, well, you know, Jesus may never have existed at all, and all this stuff was made up. And he's got a section here on page 148, 149 that says, well, if certain things are likely to have happened and had some notoriety, then you would think other Roman Greek historians would have heard about it, right? So is there any evidence outside of the Christian tradition? And yes, there is. Now, it's not contemporaneous. It's 100-ish years later. But again, if the Patriarch of Constantinople can send a book to London, and by the time it gets to London, the King James Bible has already been finished. Then it takes a while for stuff to get around in the ancient world, right? So we've got a reference by Tacitus, the Roman historian, who wrote a history of Rome in the year 115. So about a century after Jesus. He mentions the fire set by Nero that took place in Rome in 64, for which the emperor blamed the Christians. Tacitus explained that the Christians get their name from Christus, who was executed at the hands of the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. Okay,
Is it Josephus contemporary?
Right.
next paragraph. I just read from here, Josephus is mentioned there. Not quite, a little later. So in addition to pagan sources of the first century, we have non-Christian Jewish sources. This is the famous Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who around 90, so roughly the same time that the Gospel of John, because remember, I think in the first session I mentioned that after the Jewish revolt, the destruction of the temple, that was in 70, which essentially wiped out 3 of the 4 Jewish groups that we know about. There were the 2 major groups, Sadducees and Pharisees, Republicans and Democrats. And then you had 2 minor groups, the Greens and the Peace and Freedom Party, the Zealots and the Essenes. And in the aftermath of that first Jewish revolt, 3 of those 4 are wiped out. So the only one that survived is the Pharisees. And they got together 20 years after the destruction of the temple, only 16 years after the fall of Masada. So this is still very fresh. In 90 AD, and they had this Council of Yavneh, where they had to decide, what are we going to do with these pain in the butts who claim that this Jesus guy was Messiah, who keep rabble rousing, and what are we going to decide is really authoritative? And it's at that decision when Christians are declared non-Jews and expelled from synagogues, which means they lose that protection under Roman law. And they decide that the Septuagint that they've been using for 300 years is no longer going to be considered scripture. If it ain't in Hebrew, it ain't the Bible. Which is how we get the Old Testament Apocrypha, because those are things written in the post-Alexander period that were composed in Greek, not Hebrew. So, and it's at that point, or immediately after that point, when the split, the schism between Christians and Jews, and which is reflected in John's gospel, where Jesus' enemy is not the Pharisees, it's not the Sadducees, it's the Jews killed him. And so Josephus is writing about that time, the post-Yavneh era. And he says, he wrote a 20-volume history of the Jewish people from the time of Adam and Eve down to his own day. In this lengthy book, he does not talk about Jesus at great length, but he does refer to him twice. In one reference, simply identifies a man named James as the brother of Jesus, who is called, he's written Messiah, okay, that's Greek. It's a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew. The Hebrew word is Mashiach, which means anointed. And the Greek equivalent of that is Christos. Okay, so that guy who some attribute that title to. The other reference is more extensive. I'm now on the top of page 150, but it is also problematic. In it, Josephus seems to confess that he himself is a Christian, but we know from his other works that he was not, because he wrote an autobiography. Scholars have long known that Josephus's writings were not copied by Jews throughout the Middle Ages, since he was probably considered a traitor to the Jewish cause in the disastrous war with Rome, in which Jerusalem was destroyed in 70. His writings were copied instead by Christians. And then he talks about how later Christian scribes may have inserted some things that Josephus probably did not write, which make Josephus sound like he was a Christian, but he was not. He was Jewish. Writing an apology in the aftermath of that same war, when Jews throughout the empire now have a bad name because they were viewed as insurrectionists against Rome. So it puts a mark on their head wherever. And remember, there are synagogues throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. So they got to interact with their fellow Roman citizens on a day-to-day basis, but now they've got this black mark. So Josephus is actually kind of writing an apology for, this is who we really are, guys. I know what you may have heard in the popular press and in the fake news, but let me tell you who we really are. And he tells the story. Because before that war, Jews were actually fairly highly regarded. Intelligent, very ancient religion. They've lived there for a long time. They have all these rules that they live by. They're very self-disciplined people. So before the revolt, average man on the street opinion by a non-Jew of their neighbor Jews was fairly positive. Until a certain trouble. And then it took a dark turn. Okay. So it's interesting that Nero, when Rome burns, this is in the decade of the 60s, just before the revolt, doesn't blame the Jews, but he blames that troublemaking sect within the Jewish group, the Christians. So it takes 30 to 35 years for Christianity to spread beyond Palestine, clear to the heart of the empire. That's pretty remarkable.
It's pretty fast, actually.
Yeah, it is pretty fast.
We can't get close going that fast enough.
Oh, you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised. Talking about the guy that did what he did in Buffalo yesterday at 4chan. Let's see, I flagged another. Oh, and that, we got to quit pretty soon. Rats, there's so much to talk about. Excuse me. He's talking more about the apocalyptic element within what was likely Jesus' teaching in Mark. It's condensed into the 13th chapter. It appears in other places. And I remember some of my professors debating whether or not Jesus really was an apocalypticist, or whether that was such a prevalent notion in the common understanding of what would happen when Messiah came, that these later writers inserted it there, whether it was originally there or not. But I'm on the bottom of page 161. It says Jesus' ethical teachings need to be placed in that apocalyptic concept. Many people understand Jesus as a great moral teacher, and of course he was that. But it is important to recognize why he thought people should behave properly. In our day, ethicists typically argue that people should behave in ethical ways so that we can all get along for the long haul in happy and prosperous societies. This morning, reading about the mass shooting in Buffalo, we're at 138 mass shootings this year alone, and it's only early May. How are we doing on getting along? Not very damn well.
No.
It comes and goes. It comes and goes. Yeah. Now, and I wanted to. Okay. The next sentence is what I underlined. For Jesus and the early Christians, there wasn't going to be a long haul. because this apocalyptic war between the forces of good and evil was going to happen any day now. So again, if you think it's going to happen before you kick the bucket, are you going to go to the time and bother and expense of setting up an elaborate organizational structure? Are you going to write down every word that you go around and talk to people who were at this incident where Jesus did this or where Jesus did that and copy it all down? That was expensive and it took time. And most people were illiterate anyway. Why write it down if most people can't read it?
That's all we have.
Pardon?
That's why we have letters. It's mostly letters.
That were read by
Right, that were read.
the one person in the community who could actually
They
read.
were the audio.
Yes, thank you. Yes, audio.
So did the organizational structure then come after these decades where the apocalypse hadn't come? And so then
Yes.
decided, well, we're in this for the long haul.
Yeah, that's part of why the letters attributed to Paul that talk about that kind of structure were likely not written by Paul,
Yeah.
because there wouldn't have been a need for that structure when Paul was alive, because he expected this to happen day after Tuesday. And clearly, you know, and again, that gets back to that. What do we do if what we thought was going to happen a week from Tuesday didn't happen? What's next? Is it next month? Is it next year? Is it, and looking around the room, if we have to wait 10 years, some of us are not going to be here. But he clearly said it would happen before we died. So, and again, and this is the question that Brown addresses, I think, very well in his book. And that book is now 25 years old. So again, this isn't new. How did that Christian community that is still young, but it's not early, it's now a couple of generations have passed, and they're still spreading the message. How do they adjust to this fact that the thing they thought was going to happen hasn't happened? So for Mark, it's still immediate. For Luke, he writes the second volume to talk about, okay, so God has given us a little bit more time to spread this message throughout the entire empire, not just our little corner of it. And that worked for, I don't know, another 10 or 20 years until another whole generation has come and gone. Until by the time John is writing, he simply says, I think we just blew it. We misunderstood what he meant. He did come again. It's called Easter. And the kingdom is not out there, it's in here. It's an internal change, not an external one that we are going to be passive witnesses to. Because this cosmic battle is not between human armies. It's between angels and demons. We're just collateral damage, depending on which side you're on, right? You're either going to be on the winning side or the losing side. So, it's 25 after. We got to quit. All right. So next week we're going to get into where are the roots of Christianity. And I didn't touch on the second chapter for today, which was all of the variants of Christianity, the different, according to the Orthodox side, the heresies, Docetism, Nestorianism, Marcionism, Arianism, Gnosticism, which give us these other books which were in circulation and known, but were not included 200 years later in the canon that you and I know as the New Testament. Some of these I have in Greek here. I have the Dead Sea Scrolls here. I do not have anything that has the Nag Hammadi library, sadly. But there was a lot of other stuff floating around. And some of it at various times was considered authoritative, and in some communities was accepted as having the authority of Scripture. but later on didn't make the cut. And the Gospel of John came very close to not making the cut. But we didn't have time to talk about that at all today, which is kind of too bad because it's fascinating. Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you all next week. Bye, guys.
Guys, bye.